So we're pleased to have everybody join us for the first gathering of our book club in 2023. And my name is Pamela Silverman. I'm one of the founders of the Smell and Taste Association North America. Katie and I, along with our strategic expert advisors, Dr. Paulie Joseph, Dr. Nancy Rawson, who's with us today, and Jennifer Trackman, who's with us today, we all formed STANA in 2022. And I'm an acquired anosmic. I lost my sense of smell due to a sinus infection over 13 years ago. We launched this book club, really to create a safe space for people in our patient community and provide a way to have informative and interesting exchange of ideas. This is our fifth session, and we've recently announced our 2023 selections, which will meet again in May. So today we have an hour to explore On the Scent, Unlocking the Mysteries of Smell and How Its Loss Can Change Your World with author Paola Totaro. We'll start with a conversation between Katie and Paola and then open up for discussion. And just, keep in mind, we are recording this session and we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So we'll leave time for that. We'll keep everybody on mute while Katie and Paola are talking, and then we'll open it up so that people can come off mute and ask questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Katie and Paola. So I mentioned Katie is a co-founder of STANA, and Katie is an acquired anosmic who lost her sense of smell after suffering a post-viral infection in late 2008, early 2009. Katie created the Smell podcast in August of 2018 to share listener stories, while also serving as an undergraduate admissions counselor. And since the launch of the podcast, she's recorded over 100 interviews. She's an adjunct professor, also a Fifth Sense ambassador, and a member of the Patient Advocacy Committee of the Global Consortium for Chemosensory Research. And I was excited to see that Katie was mentioned in On the Scent. It's our honor to have Paola here today to discuss her book, which she co-authored with her husband and accomplished writer Robert Wainwright. She is an Italian Award-winning news anchor, editor, and former president of the Foreign Press Association in London. She's been published internationally in newspapers like the New York Times, Guardian, Independent, Sydney Morning Herald. I thought it was very interesting to see you've interviewed many legendary figures like Helen Mirren and Ozzy Osbourne and Nick Hornby. You. And now is a freelance correspondent based in London. And we can see from the book that you are adept at taking complex issues and making them understandable to the reader, which is something that really aligns with STANA and our mission to bring the conversation of smell loss, make it more accessible to our patient community. And in this book, you really definitely captured a scary moment in our recent history as COVID was becoming a global pandemic and thousands of people were losing their sense of smell and taste daily. And you shed light on the work that researchers and medical professionals were doing. And you really, give voice to patients who've experienced this loss. So with that, I would like to welcome Katie and Paola.
Thanks, Pamela. All right. We are so excited to have you here, as Pamela said. So let me just dive right over to my questions and we can get started. So Paola, can you please tell us about your book, On the Scent, Unlocking the Mysteries of Smell and How Its Loss Can Change Your World? What inspired you to write this book?
Oh, well, basically the loss of smell. Effectively on March 27 at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of 2020, and I'll never forget the date or the moment, I lost my sense of smell. And it was probably, we'd been in lockdown in London for about 5 or 6 days. We knew about COVID, but we knew nothing about what was coming. I was lucky in the sense that I'd been covering COVID in Italy, and I had already made contact with some frontline doctors in the north of Italy. You'll remember that Lombardy was the first region to go into lockdown. And so when it happened to me, in a way, I was lucky because I'd already heard anecdotally that this was a symptom of COVID, or that patients were coming in, and some doctors in Italy were reporting this sudden onset anosmia. And to cut a long story short, apart from the terror of what happened and the absolute sort of earth-shattering moment that I put my nose in perfume, I couldn't smell it. I put my nose in bleach, I couldn't smell it. This sudden loss of something that went from 1 second to the next. I'm a journalist and I got immensely curious. And so I embarked literally from the very first days on a journey to try and find out what was happening in the world and why this had happened to me and what it meant. And so a year on, I wrote a magazine feature for The Australian, which is the Rupert Murdoch-owned national paper in Australia. And from there, I thought, my gosh, I've got so much more that I want to say. And so I quickly put a pitch together to an agent, and they really liked the idea, and my lovely publishers, Elliott and Thompson, bought it, and there off we went. So it was another year and a half after that till the book came out. So it was really to take readers on the journey with me on this, to find out what had happened to us all.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it was quick. So you actually wrote this book very quickly with your co-author, Robert Wainwright. What was that like for you guys? What was the writing, research, and publishing process like for this book?
Well, look, I was immensely lucky for two reasons. Three reasons, really. A, I had the experience. So I was logging and writing about what it was like to have lost my sense of smell. And then 6 or 8 months on, suddenly, these tiny tendrils of scent would come through. And so all the way through, I knew that I wanted the personal, to underpin the science. But then I also found myself in the incredible position where all the olfactory scientists globally were locked out of their laboratories, and they all had time to talk to me about what they knew, what they were discovering, what they were hearing. So there were days when I spent an hour and a half with, a professor in Harvard or Thomas Hummel in Dresden, where they literally gave me their time to tell me what to read, to lead me in terms of research papers, and then just to explain things, because I'm a journalist and I'm used to translating complex issues into things that might be readable to the layperson, but I'm not a scientist. So I was really lucky. I basically had a year and a half or a year or so of science education at the hands of some of the very best people in the world. So yeah, it was quite an adventure.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And once the book was published, how did people respond to your book? How have they responded to this book?
Look, I certainly in the UK and in Australia, where I come from, I'm Italian, but I grew up in Australia, there was enormous interest, but for very different reasons. In the UK, we had, the first waves of COVID. There were thousands and thousands of people that lost their sense of smell very early, but there was a great delay in anosmia being placed on the symptoms list for COVID. And so there was great interest about the politics. There was interest because there were people still struggling. Whereas in Australia, it was a little different because they'd been in such strict lockdowns for so long that they actually missed that aspect of COVID. They didn't really get the anosmia epidemic that we did, and certainly the US did. So they were more interested in just the sense of smell and shining the light on this sense that so many people don't even really understand or didn't know before they read the book that flavor is intrinsic to the olfactory system, that it's not just your tongue. So yeah, I think it's been particularly for people that have had the experience. I think it's a book that has struck a chord, which is great for me. I feel if I just make one person feel better about what's going on with them, then I've achieved my goal, I guess.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I know that any type of smell dysfunction has really negative impacts on someone's quality of life, but is there something that was more funny or more memorable? That stuck with you from when you were anosmic? Does anything stand out?
There are so many things when I look back that kind of so bizarre. My recovery took a long time. It took nearly 18 months, maybe more. And there were times when I could smell something cooking. I live in a terrace house, classic sort of London terrace house. So it's narrow and lots of stairs. And so cooking smells go up, and I knew the smell, but I couldn't for the life of me, tell you what it was. In other words, I couldn't label it. And I mean, that sort of caused a bit of hilarity in our house, because occasionally I would think it was onion and it was actually, dog food. Or it was just that kind of confusion that led to some amusement. But I things in particular, I'd have to have a bigger think about that one, I think.
Mm-hmm. My next question for you is, given your personal experience and your reporting on this book about how the health and medical system treated smell loss during the pandemic, what are ways that you think clinicians could do things differently or do things better when treating patients who present with smell loss or distortion?
Well, one of the central parts of the middle part of the book was looking at the enormous delay and almost there was almost a refusal among the upper echelons of the policymakers, health policymakers, that were advising the UK government at the time to accept that anosmia was indeed it was a symptom of COVID. And I guess what really made me, one of the things that I had no idea about until I really started to talk to physicians, till I went to Dresden to talk to Thomas Hommel and many of his colleagues, I had no idea that anosmia is related to or can be a sentinel for other neurodegenerative diseases. So, if we knew that at the time, and the health physicians and the top echelons of UK knew that, it really shocked me that there wasn't more attention, or that it wasn't taken more seriously. And I suppose the takeaway for me in the 3 years that have passed is that in the end, GPs at the frontline level, at least in the UK, they still don't seem to acknowledge or understand or know that smell is a sentinel for health. And so, I think a really powerful message needs to continue to be, and whenever I talk about the book, certainly in the UK, is that really smell needs to be taken more seriously at the frontline level. And GPs, if somebody reports that they've lost their sense of smell, they're not to ignore it and just do this, but to really explore what's happened, and potentially, I'm sorry, can you hear my cat?
It's okay.
It started to, a little bit of a distraction there. Yeah, so to me, shining a light on the importance of this sense as a tool for diagnostics, potentially, and all the way through to understanding how important it is to well-being, how important it is to mood, how important it is to the enjoyment of life, the hedonic sort of nature of things. That to me is extremely important.
Yeah, that's one of the ultimate goals for STANA, is a world where we have universal chemosensory testing, so that we can start to identify when people have lost their sense of smell, or when their sense of smell has changed, because it does have so many impacts on someone's quality of life and on their health. I guess my question for you is, after having done all of your research, what do you think it will take to make smell just as universally tested as like vision and hearing? And I'm throwing this out of left field at you.
That's a difficult question, because I think there are, as always in health policy and changing health policy, cost is fundamental. And then, on top of the cost of smell tests, there is time. And of course, time in a GP's office when there's not enough GPs, in the US, a similar issue. They're very different systems, obviously, but resources are at a premium. So I guess in the end, it's going to take some level of innovation whereby smell tests can be perhaps done rather more quickly, or perhaps in a more cost-effective way. And then, of course, the importance of educating health nurses all the way through to doctors. It's going to take time. But I guess with organizations like STANA and Absent here in the UK, and with this epidemic of anosmia, we're all talking about the same thing, which is a wonderful thing. And maybe just plug away, keep dripping away at the goal.
And one other question I have for you that comes to mind is, I know that you became anosmic due to COVID-19, but since then you began to recover your sense of smell. So I know it's very subjective, but how would you rate your sense of smell now compared to before you had COVID? Do you feel like you fully recovered, or are there areas that are still affected?
That's a good question. And part of the book, one of the most exciting and probably eye-opening periods, I spent a week in Dresden with Professor Hummel and a whole pile of olfactory scientists, students, medicos. And part of that experience was to be tested properly. I then had an MRI to have a look at my olfactory bulb. So I actually, unlike most people, I have a really good knowledge and understanding of how good it is, if you like. And for my age, it's okay. It's recovered quite well. I'm 63, so we expect a certain amount of loss, but distinguishing and thresholds are not sort of up there really, which is interesting. And I myself feel that. And the other thing that I really do notice is that I still have times when I will perceive an odor and I know that I know the odor, but my brain doesn't tell me immediately what it is. And it can be, something very familiar. As I say, frying onions, sometimes I'm just perplexed. And it's not till somebody says, I'm frying onions, or I'm frying bacon, or there's a cake in the oven. I still have a kind of connective lapse, if you like, or yeah, it's not quite right. And I suspect, perhaps it never will be right. At the same time, I have so many other smells. I can smell perfumes, I can smell flowers, I can taste, flavors have come back, but I'm so grateful that what's kind of not quite there, I'm just accepting as, there but for the grace of God. I could have ended up with nothing,
Yeah.
So.
And having gone through this experience and now you have recovered some of the smells, what advice would you offer for people who are dealing with smell dysfunction, who are like in the thick of it?
Do you know, I still have people, and it's rather lovely, really, because there are people that read the book and then they'll find me because I'm a journalist. They can find me easily on email, and they'll email me and say, I'm really scared. Do you have fluctuations? What's happening? Has this happened to you? And one of the joys of having done this book and having had the experience is that you can reassure people. And one of the really interesting things, the book's just come out in the UK in paperback, and we did a new chapter because an Italian ENT specialist who I interviewed had done some work looking at recovery times. And traditionally, ENTs used to say that after virus or, a sinusitis or loss of smell that came with something external like that, if you hadn't had it back in 6 months, then, chances are it wasn't going to come back. Well, COVID's completely changed that. And the reality is that at this point in time, we can know that it can take 2 years and more. So, and I feel myself that I'm still improving and that there is still a process of regeneration or a process of healing. And so I would say to people that are in the thick of it, do not lose hope. Do your smell training, however you want to do it. I used to do it with my perfumes because I really miss them. Every day I would smell the ones that were really familiar to me, or flowers or whatever. Keep imagining the smells. If you can smell nothing, think about it, be mindful about what you remember, and slowly but surely, things hopefully it'll come back, and so I would say persevere and be reassured that certainly with COVID, in the great majority of cases, we think 95, 96%, there will be some recovery, if not all.
Great. I want to pass it over to Pamela because I think that she has a question or two for you. So we'll hand it over to Pamela and then we can open it up for some Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, I really I appreciated, there's so many things that you delved into. I've read some books, on this topic, but I just felt like you comprehensively handled this, but did it in a way that the lay person can get their arms around. One area that you touched on was language around smell. And that is something that, you know, now that I'm somebody with a loss of smell, I so appreciate, like, we don't have the vocabulary to describe things. And at least I have, I was able to smell early in my life, right? So I have, you know, some sense of what people are talking about when they tell me it's musty or it's this, but we know congenital anosmics, that makes no sense, you know, so I was curious in your work, like, did you sort of see some ideas about how to improve upon that, or as a patient organization, you know, how can we help move that forward and improve language around smell so we can help this patient community more?
Yeah, I mean, they're interesting observations. I mean, I think one of the most fascinating interviews I did was with a Spanish philosopher who was congenitally anosmic, and who, Professor Maria Tavala, and I, you know, talking to her about how her perceptions of space, her perception of, I mean, I had never thought about the fact that a congenital anosmic will not have that sense of stuffiness, of mustiness in a closed room, because they've never had that experience. So the experience of space being restricted and, you know, stultifying, it's just not an experience that they've had. Similarly, if you do have a sense of smell and you're driving along and you know that around the corner is the seaside because you're smelling the salt, or you're smelling, you know, the brine, so your horizon goes past what your eye can see, whereas the anosmic doesn't have that. I found that incredibly fascinating, because it's an entirely different existential experience. And I suppose that the only way that we can, you know, you ask the question, how can we improve it, is to have lots of dialogue with people that have had these very different experiences, who experience the world in these very different ways. So I'm not sure that we need to find a new language to describe smells, but I think it's really important for us all to talk about the way we experience the world, you know, differently, having a sense of smell or not, or even having a little bit of a sense of smell, or let alone for people, unfortunately, that are, you know, going through a parosmia or a period of sort of distorted and awful smell. I think it's, you know, as with anything, it's education, it's discussion, it's ensuring that the subject's on the table and it's not, you know, dismissed as less important than, you know, any of the other senses, I think. I'm not sure if that answered the question, Pamela.
I'll go to Nancy next.
Can I just let this cat out 2 seconds?
Sure. We all understand.
I'll use that to say I'm sorry I was late.
To my cat, I think.
Yes,
I'm so sorry. He was yowling. It was just. I'm back.
Okay, thanks. Very interesting observations. One of my questions has to do with the fact that, you know, the way you've described your experience, intermittent, and just the way it affects you in your environment and so forth, kind of reminds me that we really have had this problem with how we test smell function, not capturing the full experience of smell. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience with smell tests that you've done, and how they do, or what are they, or are they not capturing, that we need to think about as scientists?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose everybody here would know that you know, that the two systems that are used the most, the sniff and sticks and the you know, the US model of the booklet. Obviously they test you know, your identification thresholds, etc. I think what COVID has shown, and certainly what I learned talking to neuroscientists, is the incredible complexity of the reconstruction of those scaffolding cells that have been destroyed by COVID, and their role in the way we we smell, or the correct way we smell. So how do you measure what my experience is, which is that I can smell the frying onion, but there's something between my nose and my brain that has yet to reconnect in a way that allows me to do that in an instant as it used to. I don't think you can measure that. I can't imagine that it's visible or measurable. So I suppose for physicians, asking, apart from the classic smell test, asking the patient's experience and saying, do you notice anything different? Are there any delays? Are there, there are times when I have to ask because I think I'm smelling something like burning or the smell of an oven when you've left the oven on and there's nothing in it, those kind of things. But I still have to ask those around me to ensure that I'm not imagining it, because I still don't have a kind of handle or complete confidence in my olfactory system.
So it's sort of the connection between the sensation and the memory of that sensation, to put a word to it. I think that there are ways of measuring that from other, from memory research and from other kinds of studies that we probably should be looking at.
I suppose, yeah, you say it's memory, it probably is. For me, I always think of it as recognition. And I suppose recognition relies on memory, doesn't it? So it's the same thing, yeah. But I do think that to really get a sense of a patient's recovery or how they're going, it's all right, he's gone. Sorry, my husband had come to get the cat. I've done it. It is to tease out and get them to really give you their experience, because I think people who have lost their sense of smell, I think everybody here would share this, you sort of almost don't want to push it too much. You don't want to go on about it too much, if you like. I get lots of people that contact me and almost feel apologetic about asking questions, which is really sad, because you wouldn't feel that way about if your eyesight was failing or if your fingers weren't. So
yeah, how do we demystify that? I think there's a detection threshold where something's there. Then there's a recognition threshold where something's there that you've smelled before. And then there's an identification threshold where something's there, you've smelled it before and you can name it.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to start thinking about tests that really get at that level of nuance.
Yeah. Which is really complex, right? Hugely complex. And they take time, and it's interesting, that one of the things that appears to be very common is people they describe their own sense of smell. Generally, their own description of their sense of smell quite often doesn't fit with the actual tests, both ways,
Yeah, a lot of times people say it's perfectly fine, but when you test them, it's very poor, actually.
And it's really poor, yeah. Or people
lose it gradually.
Yeah, yes, that's true. If they're not aware of the loss, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. I should have I mentioned you at the start, but we should have introduced you officially that you're the acting director of the Monell Center. And I know that several of your colleagues were mentioned in the book. And so we'll go to Jane next. And Jane, if you'll just introduce yourself when you go ahead to ask your question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jane Leland. I have a background in flavor chemistry and taste biology. I worked for 30 years in the corporate world at Kraft Foods as a researcher and retired about 5 years ago from there, and have a long and positive history with Monell affiliation there, just as a collaborator and a partner. I'm sorry I was late. My senior dog would not come in quickly enough from outside. And
I'm glad I'm not the only one with recalcitrant pets.
no, there's a lot of pet things going on here today, but I come at this from bit of a different angle. As far as I know, my smell and taste are intact, maybe not completely given my age, but mostly. And obviously that's been a huge part of my profession, not to mention just the rest of life. But what strikes me as you were talking about, as Pamela was mentioning, flavor language, how to talk about flavors and all of that. So I was remembering back to my beginning becoming a flavor chemist. I got interested in it as an undergraduate. And then when I got to graduate school, I was busy analytically measuring flavor molecules and all that sort of stuff. But every Friday afternoon, our whole group spent the afternoon getting together. This was prescribed by our professor. We got together and we, in a round table, we each smelled 10 per week of the FEMA, the Flavor and Extract Manufacturers Association approved flavor molecules. So these would be molecules, thousands of them, that are used like a painting palette in creating flavors for products. And many of them are natural molecules that also, occur naturally in various foods. And we would each, smell on a sniff strip 10 of these, and then we had to independently write down descriptors about what it smelled like to us. And then we'd go around and share what each person had written. And some of the people were quite experienced. I continued this actually at Kraft when we got there, and we had creative flavorists whose job it was to compound these flavors for products all the time. And we continued this. So some of the people were very experienced, and others of them, like me at the beginning, had never done this before. And I found I was very sensitive to smells. I could always detect them. But what was really challenging at the beginning was description. And the more experienced people all said, even one fellow who had worked at a flavor house said, "Oh, don't worry, that's very natural thing. You have to develop a lexicon because you've smelled this before. You just can't put your finger on how you would describe it." And as soon as somebody else says it, when we would go around the round table, and the words wouldn't all be the same. People would describe things differently because they had different acuities and also different language and different cultural history and background. But there would always be some commonality. And I always found that at least one of the people said something where I thought, oh yes, that's it. That's what that smell is. And then the next time I would smell it, it might even still be a little difficult to recall what I had called it. The lexicon was tough. But with practice, I developed my own sort of personal lexicon, and
Well, I think perfumers and sommeliers have that. They've
yes, absolutely
created their
they
own
do.
languages,
Absolutely
haven't
they do. Although theirs is a bit different than the flavor chemists would be.
Chemists,
So
yeah.
they used a lot of similar words, but some different ones.
Yeah.
But I guess what strikes me is the idea that you really do get it's the connection with the mind and what you're smelling and how we can label it with language. And that does come back or get better with time and with practice, but you have to have the reinforcement of doing it repeatedly. And I think Nancy is absolutely right. I mean, maybe for some, the small test set of molecules that, I don't know, most people find come back most quickly or that are most common in everyday exposure. I think we do have to think about measuring not only when people, the recognition threshold, both thresholds, the detection and the recognition. And maybe there's a component with the smell training where, this lexicon or the language aspect of it can really help people recover it. Another thing I've seen used often, again, by creative flavorists, and I've used this occasionally too, is color wheels. There's a flavor wheel and there's a color wheel.
Mm.
And some people, depends on which of their senses are dominant, but for some people, the color really helps them to kind of come up with their word or the lexicon, or kind of set, put that smell in whatever part of the brain it has to be in. I also wonder if we could learn anything by talking to people that help people recovering from strokes, because a lot of this is maybe very similar, the brain part of
Yeah.
it.
Neuroplasticity.
kinda,
Yeah.
The neural pathways have gotten a little rusty and have to either be created or gone around, or maybe just reinforced or
Yeah.
back to life.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting whether, whether working on your, as you say, on the linguistic aspect of smell could help in that latter phase where recognition and the connection is a little
Mhm.
slow. I mean, yeah,
At
there's
least
so
for
much.
some people, maybe people like you who do smell some things, but kind of have a little trouble sometimes with putting your finger on it. Because I find that even happens to me when I'm out of practice. If I haven't been working with, smelling things and evaluating for a while in a professional manner, I'm still doing it all the time in real life as we do. But when I haven't been doing it a while in a professional manner, it takes me a couple hours to kind of
Get back into it.
get it back, the same way
Yeah.
as when you're away from writing, and you get a little bit,
Yeah.
the brain gets a little rusty.
Little rusty.
And it's very rusty if you haven't been able to smell anything or been able to smell fully for months or more
Yeah.
than a year. It's
Yeah.
super rusty, I would think.
Yeah.
Just wanted to reinforce that I think is a really exciting idea of incorporating multiple sensory modalities into your smell training, because the more hooks you can give the brain to
Mhm.
recreate that memory connection to that sensation,
Yeah.
the better you're going to be. And they do this,
Mhm.
they do this for people with hearing loss, to
Interesting.
help them recognize, different types of sounds, and like warning sounds, or
Mhm.
their cell phone versus some other sound, and so forth, as
Hmm.
part of the training.
Interesting.
They use the visual image
Visual. Mhm.
and touch. They
Mhm.
pick it up. If it's a cell phone, they pick it up the cell phone, they look at it, they have a visual image of a of a bell or whatever it is. The more kind of pieces of information you can give the brain to hook on to that sensory experience, the better it will be able to fill in the gaps in what it's not getting.
What it's not getting. Yeah. I mean, the analogy with the kind of training that occurs with some stroke victims and neuroplasticity and those kind of concepts, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, it's almost a natural that you would use other cues or find other ways around. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like if you're smelling, a rose scent, rather than just out of a bottle,
Yeah.
have a rose and touch the petals.
Yeah.
Have a
Right.
rose
Remember
there.
it, yeah.
Mhm.
What they look like in the rain, and what
Right.
in the vase, and
A rose bush, walking through a garden, all of these different images that go along with it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Paola, I wanted to ask you about the chapter of your book that you actually titled the Grandfather of Olfaction, which I thought was kind of funny. So when you met with Dr. Thomas Hummel over in Dresden in Germany, one of the things that you ended that chapter with was really surprising to me. So I guess I just wanted to know more about what you thought when he told you. But basically, he's making reference to how he met with someone who was congenitally anosmic, and when they tested her, there were no visible olfactory bulbs. But when
Yeah.
she was in her 20s, somehow she starts smelling. And so, I mean, what is going on, right? Like, that shouldn't be happening. So I don't have like any specific question about it, but I'm just curious, like when he told you about that, what were you thinking?
Look, that whole experience was just extraordinary because, I mean, apart from anything else, I'd never been in an anatomy lab and I'd never actually held a human brain in my hands and seen the wonder of it. So the week with Thomas and his colleagues was extraordinary. But all of them, all of them had stories that that there was no explanation. And that was the most incredible one to me. And in actual fact, I would love to go back to them because I know they were doing more testing with this young woman to really try and understand how it was possible. But even though it was ooh-ah, how can you possibly smell without an olfactory bulb? In many ways, the segue from what we were talking about before, it's not so outrageous in that potentially there is, the brain has a workaround method. And this young woman has lived with descriptions of smell, has grown up with people saying, oh gosh, that tastes sweet or smells this, or in some ways, perhaps there's enough of a body of knowledge that's been absorbed that's allowed her to have an experience that is probably, it can't be smell the way we know it, right? Because without an olfactory bulb, it's not possible. But it's a form of smell experience, a shadow form. I look, for me, it was just yet another moment of this sense is so fascinating and so mysterious. We still know so little about it, really. That in some ways it was, it fitted in with what I'd learned until then.
Well, there was another episode of the Smell podcast where I interviewed someone who has congenital anosmia, and he mentioned to me that he smelled something one time when he was eating, and it only happened like once in his life. And I was so fascinated by that because I was like, what is going on there? I don't know.
Well, one of the extraordinary things that Robert, my husband, found, and which is in the book, is that, one of the most famous British romantic poets of the 19th century is William Wordsworth, who I'm sure everybody's heard of, and who was famous for his rambling nature. And he wrote the great iconic poem about daffodils and spring. And we realized and understood through writing of a really good friend and one of his relatives that he was anosmic, and it's on record, and we found the documents that he had exactly that experience. He smelled once, and insisted that he smelled once, but apart from that, never again. So it's a mystery. How is it possible that it would just return that once, or that you'd have this kind of lightning flash? But then again, I mean, it could well be a phantosmia, couldn't it? I mean, it could be a moment where the visual inputs are so great and it's such an emotional moment that you think you've smelled. But the notion that you could be, one of the great poets of spring and describe flowers and all the rest of it and not be able to smell, I found quite moving in a way, and astonishing.
You know what, I hesitate to admit this, but I'm not very familiar with his poetry. So one thing that comes up for me when you're talking about it, when he's describing spring, is he talking about smells?
Well, that's one of the interesting things we did. His collected works are digitized, of course, and so we ran some analytics, picking words, and the words he does not use any smell descriptors at all, except on 2 occasions where he uses the word sweet. So he's able to create these wordscapes, and really they're beautiful poems. I suppose they're very much part of the British and the Australian, being a colony, English literature studies that you do at school, but they're evocative, and they're about the arrival of spring and the joyous sort of nature of these great fields of flowers. But never does he use any descriptor that is related to smell. And who would have known? He was able to do it, but without sort of reference to that fundamental sense. Bizarre.
Right, absolutely. Jane, you have a question. Go ahead.
Oh, I just typed it, but there's a little discussion going on there too. But I was wondering, and Nancy typed at the same time, could it maybe be trigeminal? And I was wondering even about if it could be vomeronasal, which I know lots of people say humans don't have, but I've read some places where there is capability. And so you have to wonder if some of those things could be at work. And I've just started reading a book by Ed Yong. He's a very good science writer for the New York Times, among other things. And he's got this book called An Immense World. And it's all about
Oh,
the sense
Nancy
that,
has
yeah,
it.
my
Yep.
cover is different than that, but yes, that's it. And it's super interesting. I just started it a few days ago, and it's all about the senses, the perceptual systems of all different organisms and how vastly different they are. So he's already covered a little bit of smell, and now it's on to vision. And I don't know very much about vision, so it's even more interesting to me because there's so many different systems and so many organisms that can see way more color than we see.
Yeah.
Because of these different systems. And so, who knows what these people have? They don't have olfactory bulbs. It would seem impossible. And yet, maybe it's uncovered territory research-wise, and we don't know.
Yeah, I think it's
Also, I wonder if somehow, so maybe there's some other trigger or triggering mechanism, and then maybe the brain part is still there, because I have a friend who's deaf, and she always says, and I noticed this even about her, that she can't hear, but she has such a somehow like deeper or more expansive capability in her other senses, like to compensate. So, and she'll say she can feel a beat at a concert, and I think, oh, well, the beat, like I'm a musician on the side, and I think the beat is like the most boring part, like to me, and I think, what would you do without the melody and the harmony and all that and all these, fine things? But for her, this beat combined with the whole experience and watching other people experience and produce the music is like music to her. And she says, oh, she loves going to concerts, even though she doesn't hear the way that we hear. So there could be other things like that going on for people, or could
compensatory.
it could develop, to
Compensatory, yeah.
compensate, or maybe it's just that we ignore all that because we're so busy smelling.
Yeah.
If you can't smell, you have a lot more attention to focus on all these other senses.
Yeah.
Great question, Jane. I think
Uh,
Nancy, you have a question?
Yeah, question.
Maybe
and
she's going to answer my question.
a comment. Well, a comment.
That's what I was
A
hoping.
couple of things I wanted to point out. I think, the vomeronasal or the pheromone pathway is an interesting notion. We do know that there's receptors, vomeronasal type receptors in the main olfactory epithelium. We don't know what they're attached to really. But they may go to a different part of the brain. They may connect to a different part of the brain. So that's one possibility. They tend to detect things that are much bigger and heavier, but certain odors might still get there. Who knows? But there's a paper that's just coming out. I think it's in bioRxiv right now by Federica Genovese, looking at the response of the trigeminal pathway, which is the pathway that detects things like hot pepper and ginger, to what we think of as odors. And this pathway, it turns out, is sensitive to lots of different odor compounds at quite low concentrations. And even though you would expect the sensation to be one of irritation or pain, it's possible that they're actually maybe modulating the system, or that the brain actually can, because they're interacting with that pathway through different types of receptors, that the signal may be different enough that the brain can learn to discriminate the types of stimulation. And if you've never smelled an odor, if you're congenital, that you would call that, it would seem like an odor. The brain might
Yeah.
right. because it might
That's
get to
really-
that part of the brain.
Very interesting.
That's
The
really
other-
interesting. Federica was, I interviewed her for the book, and it's good to know the paper's coming out. I'll have to go and dig it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to read
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really nice work. And the other thing, I spent some time in developmental biology, and the way the nose develops, the olfactory receptors actually mature before the olfactory bulb. So you have an olfactory epithelium, nerve cells, before you have an olfactory bulb. And those in the developing embryo, the axons, the processes from the olfactory receptor nerves project back to the anterior part of the neural crest and induce formation of the bulb. So it's certainly possible from a developmental biology point of view that there's some anatomical signal that's not allowing the bulb shape to form.
Right, but the process is there.
But the
Mhm.
processes have gotten there and induced
Mhm.
connections and created connections.
Oh,
But it
that's
doesn't
fascinating.
look like an
Mhm.
olfactory bulb like we expect, because the processes, the morphology, the shape of the olfactory bulb is controlled by completely different sets of signals than the maturation of the olfactory nerves and their connections in the brain. So
Wow.
when I first read about these cases of people that could smell without olfactory bulbs, and everybody was saying that's impossible, I was like, well, talk to a developmental biologist, because when you actually think about how that system develops embryologically,
It is actually possible.
it's not really all that surprising.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Oh,
wonder
that's fascinating.
has
There you
anyone
go,
ever-
Katie. Answer to the question that came to me.
I don't
That's
know what, I
great.
don't even know what the original question was, but has there ever been, this is kind of an odd question, but has there ever been a case where an olfactory bulb has been, an olfactory bulb transplant? Like, has anyone ever tried to take an olfactory bulb from one organism and put it in another organism? Like you would
know.
do a major organ transplant? Oh, sorry, Pamela, you had your hand up. I didn't even see that.
It's a fascinating question. I don't know. I don't think so.
Not that I'm aware of. People have
Not that
done
Not that I've
brain
heard of.
tissue transplants.
I thought it was interesting though, and Paola, the people you spoke to, that there was a lab that removed the olfactory bulbs from rats or mice or. But my question, I loved the designated nose chapter. That was a little surprise. All of a sudden, Robert popping in and being the narrator, and Katie's husband also was mentioned in that chapter. But it was also a very clever way of bringing in, I felt like you touched on so many aspects of the anosmic experience, whether, it's parosmia or congenital or acquired. And then here you brought in, a significant other, partner, caregiver perspective. So I thought that was great. And I was curious, he not only lived with you through this, but then he helped you, together you wrote this book. And did it change his perspective on what you were going through all the research and pulling all the material together?
I think so. I think that he is like so many other people who haven't lost their sense of smell, and they don't really have any sense of the loss because they haven't experienced it. And so I think going on this journey really made him sort of realize and understand how it touches so much of, so many aspects of our lives. I don't think I've always been very smell oriented. It's just one of the senses that I indulge and really like. I don't know that he's quite that smell, or that smell directed. So that too meant that he didn't really understand in the early months, when I was complaining about the millions of things that I was complaining about, not being able to taste wine and food and cooking and all the rest of it. I think I think it was an education for him as well.
It always is. I think just through my own experiences with the podcast and speaking to people that way, it takes a while for people who aren't directly experiencing it to really get it. And there's different ways that you explain it, or different experiences that you have together that will just like make it click one day for those people who are in your life, that they really understand it. But Paola, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for speaking with us and going over your book On the Scent, Unlocking
Thank
the
you for
Mysteries of
having me.
Smell.
It was-
Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation, and we will be posting this on our YouTube channel. So for everyone who wasn't here today, they'll be able to watch it on our YouTube channel. Any last minute things you'd like to add, or any other anosmia related works we can expect out of you?
Oh, look, I am no, not anosmia, but I'm quite interested in the science of eating and taste. So I don't know. I'm having a think about maybe another book in this sort of science area that's related but not quite. But thank you so much for having me, and thanks for sharing the book, because it makes it's important to me. So thank you. Really
Thank you so
appreciate it.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Have
so
a good
much.
rest of your day. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks
Like-
again. Good to
Hey,
see you all.